In the last presentation, one of the themes that came up over and over and over again is this idea of national identity. Nation states are always at risk of fragmentation. National identity becomes a really important factor in maintaining some sense of cohesiveness. So in this presentation, I talk about nationalism. And for our class, we're going to define nationalism as a shared sense of belonging to a community that has or aspires to have political autonomy, self-governance. This is not necessarily connected to a state that does exist. For example, the Basque in Spain are foster a sense of nationalism, but they do not have their own state. Nationalism is a very important idea because people lay down their lives for this idea. The sense of national identity defines who a person is in relation to others who have the same national identity and who they are in relation to others who have a different national identity. The flag is a symbol of people's deep need to have an identity. Nationalistic claims usually include the following. Claims to geographic territory or location. The land becomes a part of their culture. There's the idea that land and one's connection to the land is always part of a nationalistic claim, a claim to identity that binds a certain group together. For example, Hitler made claims to certain geographic location, and Keith Basso, in his ethnographic research with the Western Apache, I believe I talked about his work before, but I can't remember. He found that claims to geographic territory, the land, were very important in a sense of national identity, belonging to a community with political autonomy with the Western Apache. You can read more about that if you read his ethnography, Wisdom Sits in Places, which I do highly recommend. Another claim to nationalism involves shared historical origins. This can take on a sanctified tone at times. There's this idea that everybody belongs to this community and should have political autonomy together because of some kind of shared historical origins. I put up images relating to the U.S. national identity shared origins having to do with the concept of the melting pot and the idea of a nation of immigrants coming together, which of course leaves important factors out, such as the fact that there were people already on this land before the United States became a nation, and that there were people brought here against their will as well, who are now part of this nation. In any case, claims to nationalism draw on some concept of shared historical origins. Other claims to nationalism include language. This one is really tied closely to nationalism. So this has to do with the form of legitimate language to be spoken. We see this in a lot of countries, English being the official language of legislation in the U.S., or at least by default. In France, the government has a department that focuses on finding French-originated words to be used in official public writing and discourse, kind of maintains that. And when you hear claims to nationalism, shared language is often used as a factor of defining who is part of the community that has a shared identity and who is an outsider. Cultural traditions are, of course, another aspect of claims to nationalism. The claim here is that people are united because they do things the same way and have over time. And lastly is a claim to political incorporation. In other words, the idea that the group should govern over themselves. So it's used as the main goal of nationalistic claims, and all of these other factors are part of what justifies this belief that the group should govern themselves. In other words, they should have their own territories and determine for themselves how they should be governed and ordered. So the question arises, how do these claims get spread? And we talked about this a little bit, or I talked about it a little bit in the last presentation as well, but I want to introduce a few more ideas. So We're going to talk about education, media, and invented traditions as ways that these claims get spread. So first, we have the idea that education is how these claims of nationalism get spread. And I guess I should back up for just a moment. You should keep in mind that these claims, nationalistic claims, can involve groups that are already politically incorporated, reinforcing the claim and belief that they should be ruling and governing themselves. Or they can be groups that are trying to achieve political autonomy. So Ernest Gellner is a British Czech philosopher and social anthropologist of the 20th century, and he is a neo-Marxist, and he said, elites in any, this is a quote from him, elites in any complex and hierarchical society will control the state apparatus to promote a particular form of ethnic or national identity. And so an example would be textbook debates about how history should be written in textbooks. He says that this is a key way that nationalist identities and claims to nationalism get spread throughout a community. Oops. The debate with textbooks and history has to do with what American identity should be taught to our children. And for Gellner, control over textbooks is a key way that elites control the national identity. Gellner has some interesting ideas about schooling. He argues that schools train people to be good factory workers, to be obedient, to operate under a schedule. If you think about it, in a traditional face-to-face classroom, you even have to raise your hand to get permission to use the restroom, which is a basic need. So he saw schools as a strong implement of state control and training or conditioning, and textbooks as one example of how nationalistic claims get perpetrated through schools. You could see, or perpetuated through schools. You could see other examples of this if you think about education as well. I don't know how many of you grew up having to say the Pledge of Allegiance if you went to American schools. No, I did, through most of my primary and secondary education. That could be another example of a way that nationalistic claims are reinforced and spread through schooling. Benedict Anderson gave us another example. He talked about media being a way that nationalist claims are spread and enforced and reinforced. Print media gives a venue for having standard language and also having people read similar things, which gives us a sense of being a group, having like a similar foundation or a similar something in common to draw on as a group. And he also said, of course, as I talked about in the last presentation, that national museums are an important aspect as well. They impose a certain narrative about traditions, and can be a historic myth quality to history that he felt was important in reinforcing nationalistic ideas. More on Benedict Anderson was in the last presentation, so you can look back at that. There's a third idea here that's important, which is this idea of invented traditions. So invented traditions claim to be, or they're traditions that claim to be old, but are actually newer in origin. And Eric Hobsbawm was a British historian, Marxist, who brought this idea to people's attention. He was doing his work in the 20th century, and he was asking, okay, so if you have an imagined community, how does it connect to the past? Nationalism involves this claim to a shared origin, so how does that happen? And he said that invented traditions versus authentic traditions are the way that this happens. People bridge the gap between history and the current shared identity by inventing a tradition that is talked about as if it was much older than it actually is. And the example that he discusses in this book is the Scottish kilt, which he says was specifically designed to purport Scottish claims of national identity, being invented by a group of Scottish aristocrats in the 1600s. We see, of course, all kinds of Hollywood representations that have people wearing Scottish kilts much earlier than the 1600s. In any case, he says in Hobsbawm's work, he found that it was invented to promote Scottish identities after a whole series of bad events had happened. So that's another way that these claims of nationalism get conveyed. And so I just wanted to briefly talk about two examples of nationalism. I'm sure you can think of many others, which you'll have to be doing for your second discussion this week. The first example has to do with the Olympics. So the Olympics incorporates all of these features of nationalism: education, media, invented tradition. These were actually an important part of the whole idea of founding the Olympic Games, which Pierre de Coubertin, French aristocrat, actually did. He was really concerned about the decline of French national identity after they lost to the Prussians, and he felt like this Olympic movement could be a way of encouraging people to foster their national identity. In other words, a nationalist movement in order to continue to solidify a group, but in a way that was really positive. So there was, this tied to professional athletes. Well, actually, his original idea was not professional athletes, anybody. And this idea of athletics had to do with moral and spiritual elements, even going back to ancient Greek ideas. And if you think about what goes on in the Olympics, there's all these ritualistic aspects, oaths and ceremonies, mottos and morals and so on. And we can see all different kinds of ideas of nationalism playing out throughout the Olympics. When de Coubertin first founded the Olympics, he was really interested in athletes really recognizing the achievements of all athletes, regardless of national identity, while still being able to foster some sense of national identity. So the current focus on competition between countries might not be what he originally had foreseen for the Olympics. And there have been historical events in which the claims to nationalism became very political in the Olympics. So, for example, in the 1936 Berlin Olympics, the Nazis planned to show the world how successful they'd been in rebuilding a German society with the superiority of the Aryan race. But other Olympians showed up and did an amazing job, for example, Jesse Owen, and really shamed them on a national scale. And so there were these ideas of competing ideas of nationalism playing out even in the Olympics. Another example of nationalism has to do with the U.S. English-only movement, and that is this idea that the United States should have only one official language and everything should be done in that language, and that this language is somehow tied to our sense of group cohesiveness. So the idea that we have one language, one flag, one identity. Whoa, sorry, that was my cat. And that is, we see that playing out quite a bit in various policy efforts and so on in education, and I think mostly in education. So you can kind of notice that as you hear different stories about English-only attempts and listen for claims to nationalism being used to justify this idea.